Okay, well, thank you all for joining us today for the webinar on the Little Market That Could, how the Seymour Farmers Market organized as a nonprofit. My name is Hal Pepper, and I'm one of the specialists at the Center for Profitable Agriculture. This is our last session in this webinar series on growing sales at farmers markets that we've been conducting this week. We greatly appreciate the support provided by USDA Rural Development to help make this series possible. And to help report the impact of this webinar, we'll ask you to complete a very brief online evaluation of the session at the end of today's webinar. And the link to the evaluation will be posted in the chat box for you near the end of today's webinar. And even if you've completed this evaluation for one of the previous sessions this week, we need you to complete the evaluation for today's session as well. A few housekeeping items. Please keep your microphones on mute and your video off during the session. And if you would now locate the chat box, please type your name and location into the chat box to help us record attendance. Please note that attendance at all 4 webinars this week will fulfill a Tennessee Ag Enhancement Program requirement in the agritourism, fruit and vegetable, and value-added producer diversification sectors. And so that we can provide a complete report of attendance to TDA for the Tennessee Ag Enhancement Program, please type in your name as it appears on TDA's list. And if you join the session by phone, please let Erica Alexander at TDA know by emailing her at erica.alexander@tn.gov. You can use the chat box at any time during the session to submit a question to everyone or to me privately. Jared Bruin, who is one of our marketing specialists at the center, he'll be helping me monitor the chat box during the presentation today, and I appreciate him doing that. And he'll be periodically updating me with your questions or comments. Please note that I'm recording the session and we'll plan to post it online so you can view it later or share it with somebody else. Okay, so we're going to jump right into our presentation, and we're going to talk about the Seymour Farmers Market and how they organized as a nonprofit. And first of all, we're going to look at some considerations for organizing as a nonprofit, and then we'll talk about the steps that are involved in forming a nonprofit and applying for nonprofit tax status. And then we'll talk about a case study for the Seymour Farmers Market. I'm not an attorney, so this presentation is not intended to provide legal advice. So as always, please be sure and consult an attorney regarding your specific situation. So first of all, just some general considerations for a farmer's market who may be thinking about what type of business structure they want to have, and maybe they're thinking about forming as a nonprofit. We're going to go under the assumption, first of all, that your farmer's market is already dealing with the challenges of starting or operating a farmer's market. You've already thought about getting the resources that you need, land, labor, and capital, working with multiple people from several groups, thinking about developing bylaws and policies and procedures, that you've recruited vendors, that you are addressing regulatory issues, and you're thinking about marketing the farmer's market, and that you've already thought about getting the right people on board, assessing interest in having a market in your community, thinking about the feasibility of a market existing in your area, and now you're thinking about organization. Who's going to manage the market? How much capital is going to be required? Where that capital is going to come from? Who's going to control the organization and who the market's going to be organized around? How you're going to implement practices, operations, and continuing to evaluate them. So we're assuming that you've already given a lot of thought and consideration to those things. And so now we want to think about how might we protect our farmers market from the liability that is associated with running a farmer's market. And we also want to consider that choosing a business structure for a farmer's market, it's not one size fits all. Forming a nonprofit corporation may not be the answer for your market. Forming a nonprofit corporation takes time, it costs money, and you'll want to consider whether your organization is a good fit and would qualify as a nonprofit. So we're going to talk about that more in a few minutes. When it comes to protecting your farmer's market from liability associated with running a farmer's market, there are several different business structures that you could choose. You could choose to organize as a sole proprietorship or a partnership, but neither one of those business structure provides the protection from personal liability to the individuals involved. So that means that if any accidents happen that result in a lawsuit, the owner's personal assets are at risk should the owner lose the lawsuit. And so that's true in the case of a sole proprietorship and for a general partnership. An LLC could be chosen as a business structure for a farmer's market, and it does protect the owner's personal assets from liability. So if any accidents happen that result in a lawsuit, the owner of the LLC's personal assets are protected. They can't be claimed as compensation should the owner lose a lawsuit. Only the business assets are at risk. And just like an LLC, a corporation protects the owner's personal assets from liability associated with organizational responsibilities, provided the organization has followed its legal obligations. So again, with a corporation, if an accident happens that results in a lawsuit, the owner of the corporation's personal assets are protected and can't be claimed as compensation if an owner loses the lawsuit. Of course, officers and directors can still be sued by individuals that are asserting that legal obligations were not followed. And so that personal protection doesn't attach to directors and officers. So many nonprofit corporations will carry what is called directors and officers insurance, so they can afford to defend themselves and their directors or officers from any claims or lawsuits that may be filed. I want to just mention that there is another business structure that can be used for a farmer's market, and it's called an unincorporated nonprofit association. And it does not protect owners from personal liability. So if you have a unincorporated nonprofit association, it does not protect the owners from personal liability. A nonprofit corporation does. So a farmer's market would also want to carefully consider whether insurance is needed, because a business structure provides some protection from personal assets, but what if there's a trip and fall at the farmer's market? What if there's an incident of foodborne illness? So insurance would be needed to provide protection against those kinds of events. Uh, the farmer's market may want to consider operating under someone else's umbrella, maybe with the city or with a church or some other nonprofit group. That's one way of dealing with that potential liability. And of course, individual vendors should carry insurance to protect themselves as well. So one point we want to make from the discussion today is that you don't have to be a large organization to be a nonprofit. Many times nonprofits are large, but the key is having enough people on board to serve as directors and officers and volunteers who are committed to the mission of the organization. And it's important to understand up front that with a nonprofit, you don't have any owners. Nobody has an investment in the corporation. There is no ownership share. It's not run by just one person. The persons who make management decisions are called the board of directors, and the board is responsible for management of the nonprofit. A small farmers market with this mindset can start and operate a nonprofit corporation. They just need to understand up front that there's no ownership of a nonprofit. Um, if you have a nonprofit and it's dissolved, you can't just take what's in the checking account for your own personal use. It has to be um, given to another nonprofit. So it doesn't belong to just one person. Uh, and it's important when thinking about selecting a business structure, take the time to get it right. The group collectively needs to decide on the organization's purpose and how you will achieve goals. You want to think long and hard about it. You want to get everyone's buy-in, and it can take a while. It can take several meetings to arrive at a consensus. It's important to, once you have decided on what you're going to do, what your mission is going to be, or your purpose, you want to do what you say you will do. If, for example, you decide we're going to have a producer-only farmers market, then you need to do just that and take the measures that are needed to make sure that only products that are raised by the vendors who are bringing them uh, are raised by them, that they're not purchasing and reselling. Or if you decide that you're going to allow some reselling and you want to set those parameters up front, maybe it's 25%, maybe it's 50%, maybe you only allow reselling when the weather conditions are such that you don't have those products available by the vendors in your market, so they may be allowed to go purchase and resell. Or you may say it's within so many miles of the farmer's market that those products have to come from. Whatever you decide that are going to be the rules, you want to do what you say you're going to do. And when you think about establishing the mission of the farmer's market, uh, it's important to recognize that that mission may change. As we said, it's not just one person's farmer's market if it's a nonprofit. So you will have a board, you'll have members, and they decide what will happen. So you give up control when you form a nonprofit corporation. It's not just one person's organization. So there needs to be flexibility. The group needs to understand that there is flexibility even over time. The mission may change, the mission of the group, but remember that the broader the mission is, the harder it is to find the volunteers to carry it out. Then once you have decided on all of these things, the mission, the purpose of the farmers market, and how you're going to accomplish these things, then you want to draft bylaws that fit the needs of the market. And those organizational documents should have a strong statement of purpose. They need to identify partners. They need to describe who's going to benefit. So for example, the statement of purpose may specify that the market is intended to help preserve agriculture in the community. So you'll want to say, how are we going to do that? And a farmer's market might think that if they're small, they don't need a business structure. But the truth is, if you don't choose a business structure, the state will assign you the default structure, and that may not be the best choice for your farmer's market. And the better organized the market is, the more likely it will continue operating. Unless the market eventually becomes a legally affiliated business association, is managed by a community group, or is government organized, or becomes a corporate entity, its life beyond 5 years is questionable. So a couple of reasons for forming a nonprofit. The main reasons are protection of personal assets. Participants, want their personal assets to be insulated from the organization's liabilities. And the other thing is to get a tax-exempt status. Most nonprofits are going to seek that with the IRS. So the organizational documents that are um, drafted are the articles of incorporation and the bylaws. And so, you know, if these are well written, um, they often help the group of market leaders get beyond just talking and start looking at the actual details of the organization. Bylaws usually specify the requirements for membership, how voting is conducted, the duties of elected officers, and other rules for the management and operation of the organization. And the Articles of Incorporation, they outline the governance of the corporation along with the bylaws. So the Articles of Incorporation typically include the name of the corporation, the type of corporate structure, like whether it's for-profit or if it's nonprofit. The Articles of Incorporation will include the registered agent, the person that the IRS will send correspondence with, or the state, uh, the Tennessee Department of State. Who is the contact person, who is the registered agent, and what is their address. And the Articles of Incorporation will say the effective date, the duration of the corporation, and it will include the names and signatures of the incorporators. So these organizational documents will likely include a statement of purpose, the objectives, if there's some committees, officers, um, you know, finances, dissolution, the name and amendments. And so in essence, these organizational papers provide documentation of the creation of the organization and will provide written direction for its operation. A nonprofit corporation is required to have annual meetings, and all nonprofits must file an annual tax return, the Form 990 series, with the IRS, or they risk revocation of their status. And the organizational documents should contain a strong statement of purpose. Okay. And also, the nonprofit should have strong statements of how the community is going to benefit. Um, are there any objectives to preserving the community's heritage by, say, encouraging gardening and small farms that having the market will help them achieve? So that's very important to show how the public is going to benefit. So when you go to start a nonprofit, forming it starts at the state level, and the organization can use either the unincorporated or the incorporated option. A nonprofit can generate a profit, but a nonprofit organization cannot create stock. A nonprofit, like we said, cannot be owned by anyone. It can't be sold. Its assets can't be used for the benefit of one or a group of private individuals. It exists to benefit others as outlined in its bylaws. So the incorporation process, when we go to form it's really quite simple. The organization will prepare and file articles of incorporation along with bylaws that outline the entity's operating rules and its board of directors. Uh, as we've said, broadly speaking, a nonprofit organization is governed by a board of directors. The board is elected or appointed according to the organization's bylaws. And then the board must then elect or appoint officers from among its members. So the bylaws need to be filed with the state to demonstrate that the organization is complying with state rules. And in addition, nonprofit corporations may choose to be membership organizations or not. Uh, so uh, if you choose to become a membership organization, uh, you're classified as a nonprofit corporation with members, then those members have specific legal rights to elect the board of directors and make other decisions for the organization. Now, we mentioned that there is the option to have an unincorporated nonprofit association. And if you choose to have an unincorporated nonprofit association, you don't actually have to file any paperwork to form a business entity. Just like if you have a sole proprietorship, you don't have to file any paperwork to organize or to be recognized as having that business entity. Similarly, you can have a general partnership without actually having written documents to form that general partnership. So simply acting in a certain manner is enough to qualify as a business. And this is possible when you form a nonprofit organization as well. When a group of people get together, like for a farmer's market, to undertake an activity for mutual or public benefit that is not meant to generate a profit, they may be forming an unincorporated nonprofit organization. And there's no board of directors that's needed with an unincorporated nonprofit association. It's easy to form an unincorporated nonprofit association because there's no need to file paperwork, no need to have a board of directors. But on the other hand, the personal assets of the people participating in an unincorporated nonprofit association, their personal assets may be accessed to satisfy liabilities that the organization as a whole might occur. Uh, so it's important to understand that. That's a real caution because you don't have that personal protection of your personal assets if you form an unincorporated nonprofit association. And since if you're going to apply for tax exempt status as an unincorporated nonprofit association, since many of the documents that are required by the IRS for tax exempt status, whether the organization is incorporated or not, and since an unincorporated organization doesn't provide protection for personal assets, it really seems logical to just go ahead and file the paperwork to become a corporation so the participants can receive personal liability protection as well. We're going to proceed in our discussion under the assumption that you are going to incorporate rather than be an unincorporated nonprofit association. Okay, I'm going to take just a moment here and see if we've got any questions or anything that have come up. I don't think there have about what we're discussing, so I'm going to keep going and now talk about how do you go about obtaining nonprofit tax status with the IRS. So forming a nonprofit at the state level, that was the first step. We're going to file our articles of incorporation and our bylaws with the state. That's really quite easy to do. It's the first step in forming a nonprofit organization. But most people who form a nonprofit corporation actually have an additional goal in mind. They would like the organization's income to be tax exempt, and they would like the opportunity to receive tax deductible donations. So this is separate. This has to be done at the federal level, with the IRS, and we actually have to apply to the IRS and ask them, can we be classified as being, number one, federally tax exempt? That is, our profit that we might earn in our nonprofit corporation. Number one, we don't have to pay federal tax on that. And two, uh, can we be classified to receive federal tax deductible donations? That is, if somebody makes a charitable contribution to our nonprofit, will they be able to deduct that as a charitable contribution on their personal tax return? So the ability, and these are two different things. Number one, you can be recognized as federally tax exempt and not have to pay tax on any profit generated by a nonprofit corporation. That's one thing. You may get that designation, but the IRS may come back and say, but you're not able to receive tax deductible donations. If you fall under the 501c section of the tax code, just 501c, you are considered tax exempt. And so that means if you bring in revenue and you generate a profit above and beyond your expenses, those monies are not taxed. All right, so the second item, the ability to accept tax deductible donations, is reserved for organizations that qualify under the 501c3 section of the tax code. 501c3 organizations are considered charities, and there are other classifications such as 501c5 for farm advocacy organizations. They're tax exempt, but they cannot accept tax deductible donations. And many organizations want both this tax exempt status and the ability to accept tax deductible donations. So they want to become a 501c3 organization, and that's what we're going to focus on. So to form a 501c3, the entity must complete and submit IRS Form 1023, the application for recognition of exemption under Section 501c3 of the Internal Revenue Code, or the shorter version, the IRS Form 1023 EZ. So this application is designed to illustrate to the IRS whether the organization meets the obligations contained within the federal tax code for a 501c3 organization. For example, the application contains questions meant to show whether the entity is formed as a nonprofit corporation at the state level, or that it has equivalent paperwork in place, and that it is formed for specific purposes, and that the bylaws contain specific clauses such as those relating to conflicts of interest and other details. Before you go to the trouble to fill out Form IRS Form 1023 or 1023 EZ, you really want to take the time to verify that you're going to pass the tests that are required to become a 501c3 organization. It takes time and it takes money to apply for this Form 1023. So before you go to all that trouble, and you're probably going to hire or pay an attorney or someone like that to file this form for you, before you go to that expense and that trouble, you want to verify that you're going to qualify as a 501c3 organization. So if you're going to get tax exempt recognition, you have to be exclusively dedicated to one or more of these qualifying purposes before you will receive 501c3 status. And these purposes include religious, charitable, scientific, public safety testing, literary, educational, national, or amateur sports competition, or the prevention of cruelty to children or animals. And just to note there, when we say educational in purpose, it doesn't require a formal school environment. Organizations can satisfy an educational purpose when they are dedicated to producing educational materials and doing broader outreach on educational subjects. The IRS code and the cases that interpret it have set out very specific definitions for charitable and educational purposes. So an organization must be careful to see if they meet those definitions. So if you have a farmer's market and it's organized for a qualifying purpose, then there are a couple of more tests that you have to pass to qualify as a 501c3 organization. There's a commerciality test and a public support test. You must be able to answer yes to these two questions to receive the tax classification. Number one, is the organization not overly commercial in nature in that it does not unduly compete with for-profit businesses? And is the organization publicly supported as demonstrated by its sources of revenue? So the IRS recognizes that if an organization gets this tax-exempt status where they don't have to pay tax on their profits, and if they can accept charitable donations, then they have an advantage over other for-profit businesses that are paying income tax and that don't have the opportunity to accept charitable donations. So you have to answer this question that you are not overly commercial, that you're not unduly competing with for-profit businesses, and there has to be public support for the organization. I know that when you're starting one, it's hard to anticipate exactly where all the money's going to come from, but that has to be your goal, to get your sources of revenue from public support. These tests can be difficult, they can be complex, and so if you're wanting to apply for 501c3 status, you really should seek information from the IRS and from organizations that support nonprofit entities. And we're going to list some of those here in a minute. Okay, so I see that we have a question here. Are we suggesting that a farmer's market might qualify as charitable or educational? Yes. It is possible for a farmer's market to qualify as a 501c3 organization. And we're going to talk about the Seymour's Farmers Market as an example of one that did just that. Okay, so the fee to file Form 1023 EZ is $400 for qualifying entities. There's also the IRS Form 1023 that is for entities who anticipate their annual gross revenue is going to be over $10,000 a year, averaged across 4 years. For those that are in that situation, they have to file the IRS Form 1023, and the fee is $850. So if you have a small farmer's market and your annual gross revenue for the market itself, the market entity, we're not talking about the monies that vendors would generate from their sales. We're talking about the income that the farmer's market itself would have. And so I'm thinking in terms of, there could be some fundraising, some donations that people make to the farmer's market. There might be some sponsorships that you may have some businesses that want to sponsor the farmer's market, get some special advertising as a result. So they might pay a fee to or a sponsorship to the farmer's market. If the farmer's market vendors themselves pay a booth rental fee, then those would be income to the farmer's market. And so if the farmer's market anticipates that their annual gross revenue is going to be under $10,000 a year, then they can file this 1023 EZ form, and the cost is $400 to file that one-time form. If they expect that they're going to have annual gross revenues over $10,000 a year, then they would file the Form 1023, and the fee would be $850. Application processing times can be as quick as 6 months. I honestly have seen it take even less than that, but it can take longer. It can take to a year or more. The IRS may have additional questions once you file this form, and so there can be some back and forth where they ask you to explain further something that you said on your application. Then you have to respond. You wait for them to process it, and then they may have additional follow-up questions. So it can take a while before the IRS issues that determination letter, which is the organization's proof of status. So once again, carefully explore your qualifications for 501c3 status before you complete the application, because not only will this save time, it will save you money. If you realize that, hey, we're not going to qualify as a 501c3, then you don't want to go to the trouble of submitting this form. And you can talk with, you can get in touch with the IRS, or maybe better yet, talk to some professionals who can give you some guidance in filing for a nonprofit. And especially if you can find one that has worked with a farmer's market before, and get them to help you draft your bylaws in such a way that you will qualify for this status. So just some best practices for a nonprofit. A nonprofit has to keep its checking accounts, its books separate from any directors or officers. The farmer's market itself has to have a separate bank account. It needs to have a separate accounting system in place. It has to adhere to the bylaws that have been drafted. There has to be compliance with conflict of interest policy to make sure that, okay, if a vote is taken on whether to do something, and if that's going to specifically impact one of the directors or one of the officers, then that person needs to excuse themselves from voting on that. And there has to be paperwork that's filed annually at both the state and federal levels, even if no tax is owed. So when we say complete annual paperwork at both the state and federal levels, we're talking about the annual tax return that has to be filed, the Form 990 series that's filed with the IRS. It can be as easy as a postcard, which just has 2 or 3 questions on it. And with a very small farmer's market, that's indeed likely what it would be. Very simple, very easy to do. There has to be a filing with the Tennessee Secretary of State as a corporation each year. Again, that's very simple, very easy to do. And you have to register with the Tennessee Department of State charitable solicitations each year. So there's a form SS 6042 exemption request to apply for exemption for a charitable organization if its charitable solicitations are under $30,000 a year. Not hard to register for that, it's not expensive. And we'll talk a little bit more about what those costs are as we keep going here. So now I want to talk about the Seymour Farmers Market. Seymour Farmers Market is in East Tennessee, not too far from Knoxville or Pigeon Forge. And it give you a little background about this farmers market. So some of their organizers participated in one of our workshops that we had. And in one of those workshops, we talked about personal liability and how that attaches to someone that's, for instance, if you have a checking account, and if that checking account is in an individual's name, and that checking account is used to put the monies that are received by the farmer's market itself from, let's say, vendor fees that are collected, and if that's put into a checking account, and if it's put into a checking account that has an individual's name on it, and that individual's social security number is attached to that checking account, um, all of a sudden that person is potentially liable for whatever goes on at that market, because it's been organized essentially as a sole proprietorship. And so anything that individual has personally is potentially at risk if there is an event that happens at that farmer's market where somebody sues the market. So upon realizing that and recognizing it, they came to us and said, can you help us identify someone to help us organize, help us become a nonprofit? And so we helped them by pointing them in the direction to get someone to help them with that. And they continued to involve us as they went through that process so we could learn from it and share some of those things with you today. So a little background, the history of the Seymour Farmers Market. They started 20 years ago. The vendor whose picture is there in the lower right corner, longtime vendor Frank Vandergriff, he's age 97, I believe. He's been with the market all 20 years. And the Seymour Farmers Market started 20 years ago with about 6 or 8 vendors. Seed swapping was important then to those vendors. It still is today. And they still have a couple of vendors who were there the first year, like the one pictured here. And they went from the 6 to 8 vendors to 20 years later. Last year they had 20 vendors on average, and on an average market day they had about 200 customers. Now they have several young families who depend on farming for a living as vendors. The market is a producer-only market. No reselling is allowed. They are a Saturday market only. It's from 8 a.m. to noon. It's the first Saturday in June through the second Saturday in October. And they've decided to form a nonprofit in 2016. At that time, before the nonprofit was formed, there were 2 or 3 folks that were the main ones that kept the farmers market going. Now they have a board, and they're a much more inclusive organization after having incorporated and formed that board. The ones that are that have been the mainstay all along, they consciously remind the younger folks that they're going to die, and they want to see this farmers market keep going. And so they think about sustainability, and they recognize they're going to have to get some new vendors and some younger vendors to keep this going. They have annual meetings. Those meetings are well attended, and they're planning to apply for more grants now that they have formed a 501c3. They recognize that being well organized is a plus when it comes to applying for grants. So that's one benefit to incorporating and becoming a nonprofit. The Seymour Baptist Church hosts the market. Since it began 20 years ago, it's been the host. It covers the market under its liability insurance umbrella. And there are soccer fields and a walking track with a restroom that belong to the church. Those are nearby, so that restroom is available to vendors and customers. So here's what it cost them to start their nonprofit. They paid a $100 fee with the Tennessee Secretary of State to record their articles of incorporation. They paid the $400 user fee to the IRS to file Form 1023-EZ, and they paid $450 to an attorney to draft the articles of incorporation and file that form and to prepare the Form 1023-EZ and file it. So the total there was $950. They applied for the exemption, I believe, around June of 2016, and they received a letter of determination from the IRS in October of 2016. So it didn't take them very many months at all to get their letter of determination from the IRS. Now, what you have to realize is that before they were able to record those articles of incorporation and do any of this other, they had to spend a lot of time drafting their bylaws and discussing them. And there were several times that those discussions got heated. So it's not easy to draft those bylaws and get everyone to agree on what the purpose of the group is going to be and how it's going to achieve its objectives. But, you know, the time spent doing that is really critical to establishing that buy-in, to establishing it being the group's organization. And so once that's done, then the bylaws can be drafted and they can be recorded with the Tennessee Secretary of State, the Articles of Incorporation, and then you can apply to the IRS for the Form 1023. It costs them $20 a year to file with the Secretary of State as a nonprofit corporation. There's an annual report that is filed with the Secretary of State. For a nonprofit corporation, that fee is $20. Somebody has to do the bookkeeping. Somebody has to do the accounting. In this case, that's done by volunteers. And there is a registration with the Tennessee Department of State charitable solicitations each year. I mentioned that earlier. The form SS6042, that has to be filed. There's not a fee associated with that, but somebody has to do it. They have membership in their nonprofit corporation. It's open to all members of the Seymour area that are in Sevier, Knox, and Blount counties. So all of those counties come together. So if you're in Seymour, you could be, in any one of those counties. Membership is open to anybody in that community who is committed to the organization's purpose. So members can be local gardeners and farmers, and it can also be community members who are advocates for agriculture in the community that don't garden or farm. And if you're a member of the nonprofit, that does not guarantee you that you'll have a retail space in the summer farmers market. And likewise, being a vendor at the market does not automatically make you a member of the nonprofit. If you do choose to be a member, then it requires a contribution. That contribution can be in three ways. It can be by assisting in the educational outreach of the market, such as gardening classes and programs that are offered at the market and throughout the year. So there's programs that are offered at the farmers market, and then there are programs offered throughout the year, maybe at the public library. And so that's one way you can contribute to the organization. You can assist in those educational outreach efforts, or you can assist by helping at the farmers market. You may be somebody that is there to help put up the tents that the vendors set up each time. You may help with the parking. You may help in some other way when it comes to operating the market. And then another way you can contribute is by paying dues. They've intentionally set their dues very low. It's a nominal cost. It's $5 per individual or family. So, that contributes to the financial operation of the organization. And they set those membership dues at the annual meeting. And then if you are a member, you have a vote at those membership meetings. The bylaws establish a very clear purpose for the Seymour Farmers Market. It is to keep agriculture part of the Seymour, Tennessee community heritage by encouraging gardening and small farming. The organization will use educational activities throughout the year and the sponsoring of a summer farmers market as a means to promote agriculture in the community. So those educational activities include gardening classes. They include having a community garden, and they include having a seed library. So notice here, when they drafted their bylaws, the bylaws are very specific on what their purpose is. They want to keep agriculture as part of their local community heritage. And they're going to do that by encouraging gardening and small farming. And they're going to have educational activities throughout the year. And they're going to sponsor a summer farmers market. Now, if they had gone in there and had just said, we're going to sponsor a summer farmers market, that probably would not be enough to make them qualify as an educational 501c3 organization. So it's important to show how you are benefiting the public at large. You're trying to help keep farming in the community. You're fostering the support of small farms. This farmers market is going to enable customers to purchase what the produce or the meat or other products from small farmers in the community. And there's going to be an emphasis on educational activities throughout the year. They have 5 board members, and 3 of them serve as officers. The officers are president, secretary, and treasurer. They have a term limit of 4 consecutive years. So there is an intention of having rotating board members and giving others an opportunity to serve on that board. One of their educational activities is the Seymour Community Garden. They rebuilt it in 2016. They've maintained it ever since. They have gardening classes that they conduct at the library. And they sponsored the National Seed Swap Day with the Seymour Seed Library. The vendor fees were zero the first 10 years. Now vendors pay $25 for the entire season or $5 per week. And the vendors set this price at the annual meeting. Like I said, they didn't charge anything the first 10 years. And so they had meetings to determine guidelines, and they realized that they really needed to charge vendor fees so they would have some money for things like printing a banner. And as we said along the way, they realized that they needed to incorporate. They needed to have a checking account that wasn't in an individual's name with that individual's social security number attached. And they needed money to incorporate. So they increased their vendor fees and they save the money. And along the way, they make a donation to the church of half of the fees collected. They're collecting about $700 a year. So they're able to pay their host something for letting them use the parking lot, and then they're keeping the rest to have to in anticipation of filing as a nonprofit corporation, and for other things that they may need. They do allow crafts at their market, but the vendor has to make the crafts, and the number of craft vendors is limited to 25% of the total vendors. So they wrote that into their bylaws. So what is the secret to the Seymour Farmers Market's success? Being organized as a nonprofit works for the Seymour Farmers Market because, number one, they have the right atmosphere. Really, it's because they have the right people. That's really the key to success. They have vendors that build relationships with their customers. They have customers who support local farmers. They have volunteers. The members in their nonprofit understand that when they become a member, they'll be expected to help on things like, putting out traffic cones or assisting in setting up tents on the day of the market. Some committee members help with programs. They have programs at the market every week. They read books to children, so somebody does that. They need folks there to keep peace. They need people to do cooking demonstrations. They do those on a monthly basis, and they utilize extension and include them as a partner with their farmers market. So extension helps with conducting classes. For instance, they've done classes on how to grow food with limited water resources, or how to control pests without using toxic chemicals. They've done programs on pressure cooker checks. And so Extension's been very involved with them in those activities, in those demonstrations. And vendors are expected to contribute by donating food for the cooking demos. One time they even had sirloin steaks. And the other people that are key to having this right atmosphere are community-minded supporters that provide programs. I mentioned Extension. Their health department provides programs. They've had programs on diabetes and blood pressure checks. The fire department has come and done programs. So there are lots of community members. Some are former vendors at that market, and they're still involved as a member of that association. They provide a program every week for 20 weeks, and those program costs are usually zero. Like we said, the vendors donate food for those cooking demonstrations. They do t-shirt dyeing activities, and the dyes are donated. The children's books are donated when they have the reading program. And sometimes they have music, and so those musicians perform for free. They have visionary organizers. That board and those officers are looking to the future and how they can have a market that is best for that community. And they have people that get the job done without worrying about who gets the credit. They've never spent any money for promotion in 20 years, except maybe for a banner. They have one or two people that take responsibility for looking for opportunities for free notices in the local newspaper. Somebody contributes a weekly write-up in the Seymour Times and the South Knoxville Times. They have somebody that posts on social media. The market itself has a Facebook page, and lots of vendors have Facebook pages to cross-promote the vendors and the farmers market. Another reason they're successful is that they share success. They have term limits in place for directors, and there's conscious efforts to involve new vendors and young families. And it takes many people to pull this off. That's really true in any nonprofit corporation. There's several people you've got to have available to do all of these things. It's more than just about having a market. There's got to be something educational involved too. So you've got to be willing and able to partner with other folks who can provide these things for you. Another thing is that they have a gracious host. We've mentioned the church there that's hosted the market in their parking lot for 20 years. That church wants to keep people growing food. And the people involved with that market want to see land kept in agriculture. The community recognizes the value of keeping the community rural. And they understand that they have to meet certain reporting requirements and certain meeting requirements. We've mentioned they have to file that Form 990 annually. They have to file that annual report as a nonprofit corporation with the Secretary of State. They have to file the exemption request for charitable organizations with the state, and the secretary has to meet with the board before the annual meeting to set the agenda, to plan the annual meeting. They have to conduct the annual meeting. They have a board meeting about a month after the annual meeting, and sometimes there's another board meeting during the year. And then they have a potluck at the library at the end of the market season. So all of those things are important to having a successful organization. Some words of wisdom from that market are: take the time that it takes to get it right. They didn't incorporate right away. They took their time to figure out how and hashed out, what they really wanted to achieve. You want to know what your mission is, and you want to think hard about it and do what you say you'll do. You may decide to change your mission, and if you do, that's okay. You just need to have enough people to accomplish your mission if you make it broader. You need to know when to say no. One thing that they had an issue with is solicitations for calendars and coupon books. And finally, this last year, they said no more solicitations. We're going to say no to that. When they at one time had more craft vendors than they really wanted to have, they pulled back on that, and they limited the percentage of craft vendors to be 25% of the total vendors. Those involved with the farmers market do what they can do well, and they let others do the other things. And they work at cultivating a spirit and atmosphere that they want to have at their market. It has to be intentional. And they encourage folks to take advantage of the resources that are provided by the Center for Profitable Agriculture. Okay, so an acknowledgement here. I took a lot of the information for this in the first part of the presentation directly from the Farmer's Guide to Business Structures, LLCs, Corporations, Partnerships, and More, in a book that's published by the Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education Program. That publication is available at farmcommons.org. And thank you to Marjorie Richardson and Lucy Hennigan, board members from the Seymour Farmers Market, for sharing information. They really wanted to share what they've done so that other farmers markets could benefit from their experience, and I appreciate them doing that. Some additional resources to mention: the IRS website is the most authoritative source of information, so you'll want to check that out. The National Council of Nonprofits has a brief guide that addresses legal and non-legal considerations, and the Center for Nonprofit Management in Nashville is a good resource. There's a book by Nolo Publishing called How to Form a Nonprofit Corporation, and there's the link to that there. There are also some resources at the Farmers Market Coalition and the Farmers Market Legal Toolkit. The links to those are there. We'll be posting this presentation on our website, hopefully next week, so that you'll be able to access all of these slides and the links. A couple of publications that our center has written. One is a guide for considering and developing a farmer's market in Tennessee, and the other includes some observations, quotes, and data from market managers, vendors, and customers. These are available on our website. This is our staff of the Center for Profitable Agriculture. Rob Holland is our director. Kim Giorgio is our administrative assistant. Jared Bruin is a marketing specialist, and Megan Lefew is a marketing specialist. Troy Duggar is our program coordinator, and I'm a financial analysis specialist. If you're not already on one of our email lists, please send us an email and we'll be glad to add you to one of our lists. We have a list for farmers markets, for value-added meats, for agritourism, and for value-added dairy products. Okay, so if we have some questions, we'll take those now. I see one here. Yes, a farmer's market may qualify as charitable or educational. When we talked about that. Okay, and how many educational activities are considered enough? Well, that's a good question. I don't know that when they submitted their bylaws that they were very specific as to just what those educational activities were. They simply said that they would use educational activities throughout the year. So, you know, I guess that's up for debate. I don't know, to be quite honest, how many educational activities are considered enough. They have a lot going on. You might possibly get by with some less than that, but that's probably really not a question I could easily answer. Any other questions or comments? Questions, will there be some other webinars in the future? Yes, we are planning a webinar series that was our farmers market boot camp that we conducted. We were planning to do them in East Tennessee. We did them in West Tennessee before the virus got to be so bad. And like I said, we had to cancel the ones for East Tennessee. And so we're going to do them as a series of webinars. We're going to do them April 14th, 15th, 16th, and 17th. And those will be at the same time that these have been. They'll be at 11 a.m. Central Time. On Tuesday, April 14th, Jared Bruin will talk about merchandising methods to make money. On the 15th, he'll talk about digital marketing trends. On the 16th, I'll talk about food product cost and pricing tools. And on the 17th, we'll talk about business planning basics. We'll be sending out information about that to everyone who is on our email news list. So if you'd like to be on those farmers market email news list, please type in your email address in the chat box and we'll get that if you're not already on it. And so those are the webinars that we have planned for the immediate future, and we'll be doing more of these too, I'm sure, since we're not able to go out and do face-to-face workshops right now. And Jared has posted the link to our evaluation. We'd like to ask you to please go online and complete that evaluation. It shouldn't take you long at all. Several of you have been on our webinar series this week for the other ones, and I really appreciate your joining us again today. Even if you've completed that for one of the previous sessions, please go ahead and complete another evaluation today, as that will help us capture impact from these. So thank you all for completing that evaluation. And thank you all for joining us today. I appreciate the questions and the input. And thank you for letting us have this opportunity to share these things with you.